Okay. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. I'm pretty sure I taught you last week also, correct? When I had Corona? Yeah, well, Baruch Hashem, I'm doing better. Out of bidud. A little tiny cough left, but not as bad as last week, for sure. Okay, so today's Rosh Chodesh Adar. So I figured I had to pick a Purim topic. And I went through the list on your website. You have a list of all the shiurim I've given in the past. I want to make sure I didn't do this before. You might have heard different versions of the shiur from me before, but because it's Torah Mitzion, I have to do something Zionistic. So we're going to take just one little element of Megillat Esther. And even though like the two big biblical themes that are missing, Megillat Esther is the land of Israel and God Himself. So if they're both missing in their Tanakh, either could they be missing because they're not important, or it could be they're missing because that's the whole point. Let me make a general observation about hiding things. The fancy word in English is called obfuscation. I don't know if you've heard of that before. Obfuscation, something like that. What you do is you hide something, but the purpose of hiding it is for someone to find it. And when you look for something and find it, it's much more meaningful, usually. Like when I think I might have done with you the story of Matan Torah, Mamad Har Sinai. So how close were we to God? Did we hear from God directly the the commandments, or we were distanced? So Chumash is very unclear that people want to hear God directly, but then they back off all the time. But what really happened, you really can't figure out unless you look really clearly. But Chumash is sort of hiding from you what actually happened. But if you look carefully and analyze the Pesukim, you can find it. And that very search for what happened is sort of parallel to a search for God. So the big question we have to deal with is, if most books of Nevi'im, at least in Beit Rishon, when the Navi had a message he gave, he was quite straightforward. That usually didn't work so well. Actually, there's one example of a Navi giving a message where he wasn't straightforward. Remember Natan Navi, when he encounters David, and makes up that story about the poor man and the rich man. So why couldn't Natan just tell David, what you did was bad? But the Musar is much more powerful when the person hearing the parallel story has to figure that out on his own. The word might be satire in English, but I think there's probably there might be another more precise word for it. So I want to pick one element of the Megillah as a starting point, and then we'll get to work. I want to start with one little question, a real easy one. What's the logic of eating matzah on Pesach? Just someone tell me real quick to make sure we're all on the same page. What's the logic of eating matzah on Pesach?
A kapara for not being prepared.
Okay, that's too deep. Real simple. What does Chumash say? And why? Yeah, because when we left Egypt, that's all we had to eat. In other words, if something happened to them, how can we sit in a sukkah on sukkahs to remember being in the desert? Usually the mitzvot we keep relate to the holiday. Agreed? Now, when we celebrate Purim, how do we celebrate Purim? So first we can talk about our modern day customs. We celebrate Purim by getting drunk, or maybe by putting on costumes. That's not in the Megillah. However, according to the Megillah, how do we celebrate Purim? Well, you make a party, right? You made mishteh b'simcha, we'll see soon. And two things, mishloach monot ish l'reu and maraton lavyonim. Now, and that's it. Even in the Megillah, it doesn't say to read the Megillah. It just says have a party. That's all. A party on the anniversary, and even at that 2-day party. And call a holiday a strange name called Purim. But my point is that the main way, according to Megillat Esther, that we celebrate Purim, are mitzvot that have nothing to do with the holiday. You agree with me? Mishteh, okay, that's fine. But giving presents to the poor people, that's 24/7 every day of your life. There's no connection between giving presents to the poor and the story of Purim. And matanot l're'im, shalach manot to even wealthy people, to your friends. I don't think there's any precedent that I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, I know someone's going to say there is, but it's wrong. I don't think there's any other holiday, any else, in fact, we have any kind of mitzvah like that. There's a mitzvah to give matanot ish l're'im. Does anyone know of anything like that? No, Matot Levionim is.
Rosh Hashanah has the same language.
I knew you were going to say that. It doesn't say
Well, it does
In
say
Nehemiah- that. On Nehemiah, it says Matanot le'ein nachonlo. It says Mishloach Manot, but it doesn't say Mishloach Manot Ish L'Reu. It says Mishloach Manot le'ein nachonlo. You can check it out if you have time to look at it. You have the phrase Mishloach Manot, but it's not for Ish L'Reu. It's le'ein nachonlo. Look it up in Nehemiah. If I'm wrong, check it out. If I'm wrong, you can interrupt the share later on. But if I'm not mistaken, the phrase Mishloach Manot Ish L'Reu and Matot Levionim, separate things we don't have by any other holiday. I mean, and Matot Levionim we have every day. So it could be on Rosh, that pasuk in Nehemiah is you send Manot le'nachonlo, but that's fine. But according to the Rambam, we do that every Yom Tov. Now, we're taking care of the. In fact, Chumash says that Simchat Yom Tov is taking care of those who don't have, who aren't Sameach. Remember, on Chag HaKetzir and Chag HaSiv. So that's question number one. What I want to do is I want to use the customs of Purim as sort of a springboard to try to understand what's going on in the Megillah. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and share our source sheet. And so I mentioned one other question. The idea of starting a new holiday, like we take it for granted. We have Yom Ha'atzmaut and Yom Yerushalayim and Purim and Hanukkah, but in the time of Megillat Esther, in the time of Purim, there were no. I'm pretty sure there were no D'Rabbanans, if I'm not mistaken. There's definitely no rabbinic holidays because we're still almost in biblical times. But I'm pretty sure Purim is the only rabbinic holiday that's in the Bible, if I'm not mistaken. Correct? There's no other in the Bible, like in the Tanakh, there's no example of a made-up holiday, especially a holiday l'dorot. I can understand an anniversary holiday for that generation or for that community, but the idea of a new holiday forever, an eternal holiday, if the rabbis are going to establish an eternal holiday, it's got to be something really basic. Even when we discussed Hanukkah way back, Hanukkah, there's something much deeper in Hanukkah than just, we won a battle with the Hashmonaim. We back to the idea of winter solstice and everything. But what's the question?
Tisha B'Av.
That's not a holiday.
It's an
That's
internal commemoration.
Oh, very good. Yeah. So the only precedent, in fact, we're going to go right in that direction. The only precedent to instituting something possibly eternal, hopefully not eternal, but the idea of establishing something not in the Bible are the 4 fast days, because that's in Zechariah. We're going to be there soon. Not soon, pretty soon. I mean, within the hour. Okay. In fact, so that's why I said we don't have a precedent for a holiday, and definitely not a holiday where we send presents ish l'ra'ehu. Okay. But we do have a precedent to instituting a fast day. For what reason the fast days? To remember Yerushalayim. Okay. So number one, we talk about this idea of a new holiday, an eternal holiday. And what's the logic of Purim being for all generations? I understand in Shushan, maybe a Persian holiday, maybe for the next 50 years, 100 years, but why make it forever? Okay. And exactly what exactly are we celebrating? And then what are the special mitzvot? Okay. And remember, it doesn't mention in the Megillah, reading the Megillah. And we're going to focus on the 2 letters that Mordechai and Esther send to explain the holiday. So let's start. Let's look at the first letter at the end of the Megillah in chapter 9. Those are the dates, okay? Got it? So what is it? The dates are not just on the date. It's what we call v'nafochum, meaning specifically the days that we celebrate. The previous year were fast days. They were days of mourning because we thought we were about to be killed. And the day that was once a day of mourning and worry turns into a holiday. And these Israel Matat Levionim. So there's 2 things. One is the strange mitzvot of Israel Matat Levionim, and turning not just having a holiday, but a holiday instead of a fast day.
We had Hanukkah before as an example of turning a rabbinic holiday.
No, but Hanukkah didn't happen yet.
Oh, sorry.
It's 200 years, 300 years
Right.
later.
Right, we have we have an example, okay.
Okay. Now, in fact, it could be that Hanukkah was the precedent for establishing a holiday Hanukkah might have been based on what they did in Purim. Okay. Now, then Kimu v'kibla Yudim Alem v'Zaram. In general, it's called Bichal Hein After Shomei Alav. If the Megillah is emphasizing everyone's keeping it, that's usually a sign that everyone isn't. Understand my point? It could be one of the reasons Megillah is writing this way. It's claiming, hey, everyone's doing it. That's a way to get things started. Okay. That's the idea. So again, why dinner celebration? Why sending presents? And then the big question is, if it was kiblu v'kiblu, got it? So why does Esther have to send a second letter? So the fact it says kiblu v'kiblu already seems to indicate that maybe it wasn't so accepted. Gemara talks about that, right? About kitfunim v'dorot. The rabbis and Esther having an argument. So there's a tradition about that idea. But there's a need for a second letter. And I want to see now what was the purpose of the second letter and what was in the letter. So let's read carefully now. This is the anchor of this year. This is the end of the Megillah, Pasuk Chavtet. But Tichtov Esther Makah. You know what I want to do first? Before we read this here, I want simply to share my screen in a regular Tanakh. Because when you just see sources, you don't see things in their context. I want to just open up a regular Tanakh for a minute. Megillat Esther Perek Tet. And just see what happened. We have Aser B'nei Haman. Hold your breath. And we kill them. And then we start with Alkena Yudim. Okay. We read that. Mordechai writes these things. He sends letters to everywhere. Got it? All of these days. We just read those psukim. Okay. Okay. And then we get the last time, and I think the Megillah is here. Kiaman ben Hamadata. Okay, down. Alkein Karuli Amim Eilu Purim. Isn't that a strange name for a holiday? Because what's Purim means by chance. If it's a religious holiday, the holidays, what do you call it? That's a question of things happening by chance. But the date, Al Shema Pur, okay, now the Pur is a lottery, which seems to be this idea of things happening by chance. And all of a sudden, that's the name of, is that the message of the Megillah, that everything's happening by chance? And I'll call Divrei HaGer, okay? Now, then again, we say Kibul B'Kibul again, Hayudim Alem Azaram, and then these days, it sounds like everyone's keeping it. And despite all that, what happens? Esther has to write another letter, and this is the conclusion of the Megillah pretty much. Okay. But Tichtov Esther Amakah, remember, this is the end of the book because Perek Yud is really short, just about that little tax. There's 3 lines about the tax, which is a problem in itself. But the end of the main story of the Megillah is right here at the end of Perek Tet. And what happens? Skip the Parshiah division. And then we'll see it inside with English Hebrew. What's the second letter? Esther and Mordechai find it necessary to write a letter with full authority at Kol Tokef in order to establish this Igeret Purim Hazot Hasheni. There's a second letter. So the Igeret is not Megillat Esther. The Igeret is a letter sent to all the Jews to establish the holiday. That should be clear. Okay. Same thing as before this. Same 127 Medinot that we had since the beginning of the Megillah. Okay. What is sent? Divrei Shalom Vamet. We'll talk about it in a minute. And then why are we sending it? In order to establish these 2 days of Purim at the proper time. Okay. Now, for all generations, in all places, everywhere the Jews are living, for all times, to celebrate it the same way that Mordechai and Esther celebrated it with Mishloach Monot and Yimei Mishteh B'Simcha. And then the strange frame, the Chashir Kimon of Shabbat Zaram Divrei Atzmot V'Sakatam. So we do have a precedent. Remember, that was my question. What is the precedent of establishing a new Causal holiday? Well, the only precedent was we established fast days. So the assumption is if we can establish a fast day for all people, for all generations, we can establish a holiday for all generations. And therefore, there's something about the fast days that we're referring to here that must relate to the feast day of Purim. And Mamar Esther Ki'eh v'divrei Purim Meila. So let's take a look at this again. I want to read them again on the source sheet. I'll put it back to my source sheet now. And let's look with the highlight. So what did the second letter say? Esther writes Kol Tokef. The purpose I came in to get to Purim HaSheni. They sent Svarim told Yehudim. What's in the book? No, it's what's in the letter. Divrei Shalom V'Emet. It's a phrase that almost no one pays attention to. Because the Megillah is almost over. At night we're fasting. By day we're not paying attention anyhow. But the content of the letter, not the opening line. You don't summarize a letter and just write the opening line. The content of the letter is Divrei Shalom V'Emet. So the question is, what are the Divrei Shalom V'Emet that's in the letter? And the purpose of Divrei Shalom V'Emet is to make sure the fast days become holidays. Got that? Now, and that's question again, is the Divrei Shalom V'Emet, is it the introduction of the content? And what's the connection to the fast days? So Ebenezer on the spot points out, by the way, a lot of people, when they read this phrase here, even some Parshanim say it, it's referring to Tanit Esther. Now, who can tell me why that can't possibly be? Why can't this phrase, why can't that possibly be Tanit Esther? Just historically, anyone knows why that can't be Tanit Esther?
Because that's not one of the four.
Okay, but
That's not when they fasted. She fasted for the 3 days before Passover.
yeah. So, but if it's Esther's Tanit, if it's Tanit Esther, that was on Pesach, and that was a one-time thing, and that wasn't Al Nafsham Bal Zaram. That wasn't for future generations. Here, Al Nafsham Bal Zaram, right? That means on their and their and future generations. Doesn't that mean? The Jews Al Nafsham Bal Zaram, and also that now our Tanit Esther. Remember, Tanit Esther was the 3 day fast on Passover, when she's having her party, which is really cool. Like everyone's fasting while she's having a party. But that's on Pesach time, definitely not before Purim. Now, our Tanit Esther was instituted about 1,000 years ago. If you know your Megillat, Masechet Megillah doesn't mention it. In fact, if you know Megillat Tanit, the 13th of Adar was actually a holiday. It was Yom Nikon. It was the day, I forgot what it was. It was one of the days of Megillat Tanit. One of the days he didn't say Tachnun and weren't allowed to fast even. It was during Beit Sheni, for the hundreds of years after Purim already, that date of Tanit Esther was a holiday of our Tanit Esther, of the 13th of Adar. So it can't be, because we've only taken upon ourselves to fast on the 13th of Adar, Tanit Esther. Things started in the time of the Rishonim. Maybe the Godim talk about it. I'm almost sure it's only in the Rishonim. The Gemara for sure doesn't talk about it. Since Sifrei Halacha already, in the time of the Rishonim we have it. But I'm pretty sure it started around the 1100s or something like that. Now, so therefore it makes more sense. It's talking about the fast days. Which fast days? The 4 fast days in Zechariah, as we'll see. And so Ebenezer makes that comment. What's Divrei Tzalot? Al Nizkori b'Sefer Zechariah. Shem b'Tammuz, Av Tishrei b'Tevet. The 4 fast days that all commemorate the fall of the first temple period, right? Destruction of the first Beit Hamikdash, not just the destruction, the siege on the city, breaking the wall, the destruction of the temple, and Gedaliah and Shirei Tapleta, going down to Egypt. Okay. Patam ki kimo Yehudim anafsham lismoach b'mei Purim. In other words, it seems to be a halachic precedent. How is it possible for a group of Jews to institute for all generations a custom on future generations? Well, we instituted that for the fast days to remember Jerusalem. So now we're instituting it also to remember the events of Purim. Okay. So again, Ebenezer explaining that it's referring to the 4 fast days, of course, from Zechariah. Okay. And therefore it's a precedent for the new custom. Okay. Now we're going to look at Zechariah. What I want to show you in Zechariah. In Zechariah, we don't only have the 4 fast days, we also have Divrei Shalom V'Emet. And already now we already here have a sort of illusion. If the 4 fast days are instituted to remember Yerushalayim, and they're the basis for instituting Purim, that's already a pretty good reason to assume that maybe the celebration of Purim relates to Yerushalayim. Hope that's clear. If the second letter is trying to make this celebration something eternal for all generations, it has to have eternal meaning. Now, with all due credit to the Jews of Shushan, etc., and the Jews of the Persian Empire, I can understand a celebration for the Jews in that country. But to establish something for all generations, for all Jewish people, it's got to relate to a core Jewish value. And if we instituted fast days to remember the destruction of Yerushalayim, maybe there's a connection between Purim and Yerushalayim as well. Well, it's definitely not explicit in the Megillah, because it doesn't mention anything like that in the Megillah. My question is this theme, if it's not explicit, if it's not Megillah, maybe it's Nistar. Maybe this theme of Yerushalayim is hiding in the Megillah, but it's hiding for the reader to find it. And when you hide something for reader to find it, when you're hiding a message, you can't hide it too well, got it? But you have to hide it good to make it. When you play hide and seek, you can't make it too easy to find. You can't make it too hard. So the question is: are there enough hints in the Megillah to the theme of Yerushalayim and the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim to say that maybe the author's intent in Megillat Esther is to find a connection between the celebration of Purim and Yerushalayim, and that's why it's a sheer fitting for the Torah Mitzvah and Kola. Okay. So now I have to explain why I think those. I'm making a big assumption now, and here are the 4 fast days that Ebenezer was referring to. By Darshim Tzot Lemor, Kol Hashem. This is famous. Remember, Tzom Revi, Tzom Chamishi. Remember that's a series of Tammuz, Tisha B'av, Tzom Gedalia, and Asar B'Tevet in calendar order. Instead of being fast days, they become holidays. On what condition? V'amet v'shalom ahavu. If you keep emet and shalom, there's no reason to fast. You can feast. Okay. So that's the question. Here's that's I call the critical question: is Esther or Megillat Esther? Okay, is it assuming in writing when they write the second letter? Is it safe to assume that the authors of the second letter, Mordechai and Esther, send the second letter and write the Beis Shalom V'amet to explain the loss of Purim? Can they assume that the Jews who are sending the letter to know Zechariah's prophecy? Got it? And then if so, why would Zechariah's prophecy relate to how we celebrate Purim? Okay. So put it this way. The question is Zechariah's prophecy before or after the events of Megillat Esther? Well, when was Zechariah living? Well, just look at the first line of Zechariah. We'll get to the years in a minute. Let's take a look. Actually, maybe we'll take a break here from the share screen. Just we'll take maybe a little poll. We're definitely in the Persian time period. Okay, I want someone to name for me the Persian kings in order the way you were taught in school. How many Persian kings were there, and what were their names, and who came first and who came last? Anyone remember?
Koresh and Daryavish.
Okay, Koresh and Daryavish are famous. Okay, and Achashverosh.
Achashverosh.
Any other ones?
No.
Okay. And where does Achashverosh fit between? Koresh was the first king, according to everybody, right? He's the first Persian king. Okay, it says so. He's conquers Parasum Madai from the Babylonians. Okay, and so who comes first, Achashverosh or Daryavish?
I think Achashverosh.
Okay, so according in Seder Olam, you're right. No, it's in Midrashic history, the order is Koresh, Achashverosh, then Daryavish, and then my whole share falls apart. Why? Because Zechariah is living under Daryavish. Got it? And therefore, Megillat Esther is happening before Daryavish. In fact, Chazal say what? That Daryavish was the son of Esther and Achashverosh. You might have learned that in kindergarten, way back, or somewhere in early Jewish education. Now, there's no source for that in Chumash, other than all the art school history books. But they write it like it's a fact. It's a beautiful midrash. We'll see where it's coming from later on. And then there's another Persian king mentioned in Tanakh. His name is Artaxerxes. But how do the rabbis solve that problem? They say that Daryavish and Artaxerxes is the same king, but he changes his name in the middle of his reign. But they claim he's the same king. Now, the reason for that midrashic approach of saying there's only 3 Persian kings, Koresh, Achashverosh, and Daryavish, who's Artaxerxes, that's a whole long shit. I think I did it way back. But that has to do with the calendar and the dating. but it relates very much to Purim, we'll see soon. But if I want to do a more critical approach and begin with the history that's known to us through archaeology, through academic study, almost everywhere you turn, I'm going to show you now the list of the Persian kings. Let me share my screen with you now. Just real quick, if I open up the book of Zechariah, just to make sure we're on the same page, the Nebuot of Zechariah begin in year 2 of Daryavesh. Got it? Year 2 of Daryavesh is his first Nebuah, just like Haggai. And remember, in year 2 of Daryavesh, that's when they break ground on the second temple. Year 6 of Daryavesh, they finished building the second temple. When they return in Koresh, they're supposed to build the temple, but there's an 18-year building freeze. Only under the reign of Daryavesh, the temple gets off the ground again with the help of Haggai and Zechariah. So Zechariah's messages, the famous ones, coincide with breaking ground on the second temple in year 2 of Daryavesh. And they continue through its construction. And this is also in year 2. In year 2 of what we call B'Shash Time Daryavesh. And then in chapter 7, as we'll see, we have his final dated Nebuah in year 4 of Daryavesh. That's 2 years into the construction and 2 years before it's complete with the Beit HaMikdash. Got it? We'll read that Zechariah Perek Zayin very soon. So it's clear that the fast days are instituted during the reign of Daryavesh. Now, when was Achashverosh? So let's take a look now. I have it nice and organized here. Look in any history book, everywhere you turn, these are the Persian kings with their dates. Okay? And this is corroborated from thousands of sources. Maybe at least hundreds. There's Koresh, 538, remember the years. There's another king named Cambyses, doesn't seem to be mentioned by that name. Then there's Darius the First, who seems to be our Daryavesh, then Achashverosh, and then Artachasta. Now, if I take this list of kings and match it with the book of Ezra and Nehemiah and Haggai and Zechariah, it's a perfect match. What is that? No, it's the first line of Ezra is Koresh. Right? And then there's an 18-year building freeze until the second of Daryavesh, which fits there perfectly. Got it? And there's one king in between. So from between, that's explicit. And then after Daryavesh, there's a gap in the book of Ezra between the reign of Daryavesh and Artachasta, between these two kings. Let me annotate it for a minute. Between Daryavesh and Artachasta, that's basically, this is Perek Vav in the book of Ezra. And this is Perek Zayin when Ezra makes Aliyah. If you know your history in the book of Ezra, during the reign of Daryavesh, right, and when they start building the temple, in course, the local population doesn't let them build. There's an intifada, and they don't get along at all. And no, we're new in the country. When Ezra comes, he doesn't meet. When Ezra comes under Artachshasta, he doesn't meet Haggai and Zechariah. He doesn't meet Zerubbabel. There's all the leaders and the key characters who were around during the time of Koresh and Daryavesh are totally missing when Ezra makes Aliyah. And when Ezra does make Aliyah, what does he find? Mass intermarriage. People not even knowing Hebrew anymore. And the walls of the city are a disaster. And if I follow the outside history, it fits perfect. Why? Because it's like 3 generations later. It's like about 50, 60 years later. It's like probably 1 or 2, at least 2 or 3 generations later when Ezra makes Aliyah. And that's why there's intermarriage. That's why he doesn't find the previous generation there. So now, if I follow outside history, when does Megillat Esther happen? Megillat Esther is happening right between Daryavesh before Artachshasta. Got it? Megillat Esther is happening soon after the reign of Daryavesh, or basically within a decade or two of when the temple was finally rebuilt. Got it? And that historical information is critical to understand Megillat Esther, because that's historical context. Now, if you follow Seder Olam, which we just mentioned there before, if I follow Seder Olam says there's Koresh, followed by Achashverosh, got it? Followed by Darius, who's Artachshasta, got it? And what Seder Olam does, you see, it doesn't make any sense historically. Why? Because if you read Seder Olam carefully, this is the entire Persian time period. Got it? There's 3 Persian kings. Koresh, who's only king for 3 years, doesn't match outside history at all. Achashverosh is king for exactly 14 years of the Megillah. According to Seder Olam, he gets a heart attack the year that Megillah is over. Who knows what Esther put in his drink? But it was thanks there. And the year after Megillah is over, their son Darius becomes king, who couldn't be more than 5 or 6 years old. Okay? And he's the one who allows the Jews to build the temple because who's his mommy? Esther. You follow what Esther Olam does? And as soon as the book of Nehemiah is over in year 34 of Darius, guess what happens? Alexander the Great conquers the whole Middle East. This is Seder Olam, which has no historical basis at all. It's Midrash. When it's written, wasn't meant to be history. Again, I think I've done that share with you before, but that's a second share. Now, in essence, what the rabbis are doing in Seder Olam, they're hiding, pun intended, right? What happened here, right? They're hiding Achashverosh from where it really was, right? By saying that Darius and Artaxerxes is the same king. Right? Basically, they're hiding the time period in Megillat Esther. And not only did Chazal hide it in Seder Olam, the book of Ezra hides the time period as well. Doesn't mention it at all. It just alludes to it briefly. Tells you a lot about Artaxerxes, tells you a lot about Darius and things that happen. But doesn't tell you anything about what's happening in the time of Achashverosh other than one little line in a very cryptic way. In fact, it's really interesting in Megillat Esther, the key character, the heroine, her name is really Hadassah, and for some reason, her name is hidden. I mean, her name is Esther. Now, so let's review the key events of Megillat Esther, which I'm sure you're familiar with. The Babylonians destroyed the temple, and their kingdom, their empire, is around for 7 years, as Yirmiyahu predicted. And in the first year of Koresh, he defeats the Babylonians, allows all the people to return to their homelands, including the Jews, the famous Shibatz in the famous Cyrus decree. And the Jews are encouraged by the king, the new king, to return to the land and build their temple. And those who don't can send money, early lines of the book of Ezra you're familiar with. And when they return to build the temple, they get off to a start, but there's an intifada, and there's a building freeze because the local population doesn't get along with them. And the building freeze lasts until the second year of Darius. And because the first return was so uneventful and basically failed, that supported those who held this really wasn't redemption and stayed in exile. 18 years later, remember when everyone's down and depressed, Chagai, in the second year of Darius, gets the people inspired to start the building again. That was the background to Hanukkah, which is sure we do in Hanukkah. And he does such a good job, Chagai, of encouraging the people with the help of Zechariah. The temple, they break ground on Hanukkah in year 2, and they finish construction in year 6. All the events are in the book of Ezra. Our source is going to take place in year 4 of Darius, meaning the temple is under construction. It's halfway done, almost finished. Great hopes. And in the middle of this building process, there's going to be a question, like a shaila is coming by a delegation from Chutz La'aretz, the rabbis of the Persian Rabbinical Assembly, sending a group of rabbis to ask halacha about our custom of fasting, because they've been fasting ever since the temple was destroyed. They asked the question, do we continue fasting? So we're going to read those sources in the book of Zechariah. Okay. So remember, Zechariah is hoping for the Shekhinah to return after for Hanukkah. That's in year 2. And in Perek Zayin, in the 4th year of Darius, got it? This was the Nebuch of Zechariah, a delegation from Babylonia, sent probably to the Beit HaMikdash, but his name is Sar Etzer, that's a Babylonian name, and Regem Melech and his men, come l'chalot pnei Hashem. It's a Jewish delegation with non-Jewish names. Surprise, surprise. Now, Lemor al Kohanim, the Beit Hashem Lemor, they have a question for the rabbis, the priests in the temple, and to the Nevi'im. Okay? Have Kebba Chodesh HaChamishi, the famous line, do we continue fasting on Tisha B'Av? Right? And do we hold back, right, from drinking wine, etc., like we've been doing these last 70 years, last 60, 70 years? Go tell the Kohanim, the famous line he tells them. God says, did I ask you to fast? Okay. When you're fasting, did I ask you to eat? And God says, am I fasting? Basically, God's saying, don't ask me the Rabbanans, ask me the Oraises. If you ask me a question, what to do, as I didn't tell you to fast, God said. Did I tell you to eat and when to drink? I don't tell you when to eat, I don't tell you when to fast. You decided to fast. But here's what you should be asking me. Right? What was the reason for the fast day? The reason for the fast day wasn't to remember what happened, but to remember why it happened. So if you're going to fast, the main thing you need to do is don't repeat the same mistakes in the first temple period. Halot advarim asher kra Hashem b'yad hanavim harishonim. Referring to Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu, what we call Navim Achronim. Just remember what the earlier prophets warned you when Yerushalayim was sitting pretty before the Babylonians came in and destroyed the city. Right? Remember how nice it was before God sent in the Babylonians to destroy it. And God warns you, if you don't fix your behavior, I'll destroy the temple. So if you're rebuilding it, you want to know if it's going to remain. The main thing you need to do is not repeat the same mistakes that caused it to be destroyed in the first place. And in case that people forgot what they were doing wrong, so Zechariah reminds the people, tell the people, mishpat emet shvotu, make sure to do justice. Okay? That's a classic, make sure there's justice and make sure there's care for the needy, take care of the widow, the atam, ger, ani, don't oppress them. And more important, don't think bad things about the other people. Don't act like they're doing in the Knesset or in the newspapers or in our Jewish community. So don't think all the time what he's up to is up to. Don't have bad thoughts about your brethren, thinking only the worst of them and how bad they are. You can argue with them if you disagree, but treat them with respect. Now, that's what he told them. He goes on, and then he tells the people, okay, God's saying, just like I brought down the temple when you were bad, now I'm going out of my way to bring the Shekhinah back. And Yerushalayim can be a city of truth again, but it's up to you. Remember the famous line, old people and young people will be sitting on the benches, playing with the kids, watching the kids playing on the street. Everyone knows his famous lines. That's how great it can be. And then, I'm bringing my people back from the east and the west. It's the time of redemption. Shivat Zion. Okay? God saying, I'm doing everything to bring you back to your land. And you'll be my people, I'll be your God. It's the Brit. It's the Brit of Yitzhak Mitzrayim, it's the Brit of Har Sinai. Brit Milah, it's the core Brit of Chumash. On what condition? That you do emet and tzedakah. Means God is willing to help facilitate this final redemption of the second temple, but on the condition that you do your side. And then God said, just like I plotted to punish you, to bring in the Babylonians when you were bad, okay, and I didn't change mine. Now I'm returning now, and I'm plotting to bring you back to help you, Yerushalayim. Don't worry. And now, if it wasn't clear enough, if you want to make sure that the second temple is going to last and not be destroyed like the first one, remember you're asking, do we fast or not? So if you want to fast, that's up to you. The Nabi is going to say. But the main thing God wants you to do is not to fast. Don't make the same mistakes as the people made in the first temple. Build a just society. And in case it wasn't clear enough, if you want this second temple and your establishment in Israel to be successful in Beit Sheni, dabru emet ishet re'ehu. Right? Emet mishpat shalom shiftu b'sharechem. Remember this phrase, ishet re'ehu. Right? Do justice and do peace to each other. Vishet rat re'ehu atashvu b'avchem. Here's the same phrase again. Got it? Okay. That's what God hates more than anything else. That type of behavior. And a nation acting that way can't represent God. If the temple is a symbol and a reminder that we're God's people. So if we're a society who claims to be God's people, and our temple is a sign that God dwells with us, so God can't dwell with a nation who acts in this type of behavior. God's saying, and therefore, if you want the Shekhinah to remain and the temple to remain and get off the ground, make sure that this is the essence of your society. Again, notice the Ishet Re'eu and the idea of Shalom and the idea of good thoughts about each other. Okay. Now, wait, I just repeated the same so we can begin there. I'm sorry. Now, then Zechariah finished. It's called Hashem Tzavot. If you do this, right, then now you have to fast anymore. Remember the question, do we fast? The 4 fast days, remember? The fast days can become holidays on the condition you keep emet v'shalom. Right? And of course, the word divrei emet v'shalom we find 2 times here, got it? And where else? In the letter that Esther sends. And that's the question, is Esther's letter alluding? If my assumption is correct, you understand why we did all that? If indeed I follow the academic understanding of history, and Pshuto show history, without beyond a shadow of a doubt. Why Seder Olam changes things, that's a class in itself. But according to the most logical understanding, according to Tanakh and outside history, is that Megillat Esther is happening during the reign of Achashverosh who's a generation immediately after Daryavesh, which means it's a decade or two after the temple was built, and the Jews have not returned. And remember, this letter that Zechariah is answering was sent by the exile. And this is his answer to the exile about what they need to be doing. So it makes sense that the people in exile should know this Nebuah of Zechariah. They might not know everything in Habakkuk, but they should know everything in Zechariah. Got it? And they know that they've been fasting to remember Yerushalayim. And the question is, are these laws of Purim related? So let's look again at what we saw. Yeah, Harold, question? Go ahead.
The fact that the 4 fast days are mentioned in Zechariah, in other words, I'm not sure I understand what's the big deal here, because just because they're mentioned in Zechariah doesn't mean that obviously Zechariah didn't establish the 4 fast days. They were established probably like
7 years earlier, yeah. That's he says we've been fasting.
So they already existed. So
Yeah.
the whole issue of the timeline doesn't seem to be all that relevant to me, because you could say, well, these fast days existed from the time of the Churban or soon related to the Churban, and everybody knew about them without Zechariah. Could be that Esther, they all
You're
knew
right.
about
Esther knows about the fast days. Agreed. I agree. For the fast days, it makes sense, but not the Divrei Shalom V'Emet.
Well, the
And
Divrei
that's
Shalom
the-
V'Emet are in Zechariah. Okay, well, right.
In the book of Zechariah, no, if I follow Seder Olam, then Zechariah didn't happen yet.
All right.
No. Maybe you can say the other way around. Maybe Zechariah is building on Esther. No, it's Zechariah's answer. Maybe he's saying, oh, just like Purim, the fast days will become new Purim days. But I think it's the opposite. But now look at the content though. What's God saying? What do you call it? In Esther, I'm sorry. The month we celebrate specifically on the days that went from Yagon to Simcha Me'evel B'Yom Tov to make them be made Mishteh B'Simcha. We're having fast days becoming holidays. Got it? And what mitzvot? Mishloach Maron Ish L'Re'ehu and Maton Levyonim. That's exactly the content of Divrei Shalom V'Emet. When you read Zechariah, that's what he was talking about, wasn't it? Remember? Elav V'Mesher Tasum. Remember? Dabru Emet Ish Et Re'ehu. Have Shalom Bet Ish Et Re'ehu. And then helping the poor and the needy we saw earlier in his opening nevuah. So if the message of the fast days is to remember why the temple was destroyed, then the mitzvot that we keep on Purim are the core values that will make Am Yisrael worthy of the temple being rebuilt. It's not enough just to make Aliyah. You can make Aliyah and everyone can move to Israel and do Giant Chil Hashem again. So if you want to have a Mikdash rebuilt, right, if you want to remember why there was an exile and why God was angry, it's not because we're not living in Israel. Of course we have to return to our land, but what we do when we return to our land, how we act as God's people, because there's a reason he sent us out and the reason he wants to bring us back. So fasting to remember what happened and why it happened, that's the 4 fast days. What Purim seems to be is like a virtual Zechariah feast day instead of fast day. So the fast days haven't become feast days yet because the temple wasn't rebuilt and we're not back. But if we're going to celebrate Purim, we might want to remember what happened. Now, what's the idea, in case you didn't catch on, that the question of Megillat Esther is not only why did God save us, the big question is why were we almost destroyed? We were this close to destruction, weren't we? The last minute we were saved. But if we're almost destroyed, if there's a terrible calamity about to befall the people, there must be some reason for it. And that's the question is, from a prophetic point of view, right? What would you have to say about the fact that God went out of his way to bring in the Persians to defeat the Babylonians? He made this Persian king give us the right to build the temple. He brings in Daryavesh who lets us rebuild it, and we finally get the temple off the ground. God's doing everything he can to help bring us back. The question is, does Am Yisrael reciprocate? Do we answer Zechariah's call? Now, if Achashverosh is happening, the generation right afterwards, then obviously Am Yisrael did not answer the call. Because we're the Jews. The Jews are scattered in Me'asrim B'Sheva Medina. Where aren't they? They're clearly not in the land of Israel. Now, if you know your Jewish history in the book of Ezra, 50 years after they build the temple, when Ezra makes Aliyah, it's total mixed marriage in Yerushalayim. The walls of the city are total shambles. The city's like, when Nehemiah describes destruction of Yerushalayim, he's not talking about Churban Habayit from the time of the Babylonians. He's talking about city from the time of the Persians. But Jerusalem, after they rebuilt the temple, is totally neglected. The vast majority of them didn't return to Israel. They didn't make Aliyah, and those who were there, nothing reached fruition. That they finally got the temple off the ground. There was great hopes with Haggai and Zechariah, and it didn't happen. Kuzari talks about it also, about why Beit Sheni was a failure, because the people didn't answer the call to return. I should have brought that source, but we're going to run out of time. I have no idea what time class is to when, to 11:45? Or to, yes, okay, so we have a half hour. Maybe I'll bring the Kuzari in a minute. Actually, you know what? I'll bring the Kuzari in a minute. I'm going to show you in a second. I'll take a little break here. So remember, you can look there and you match everything up. Matches perfectly, all the things. Okay. And the fact, and my claim is, why do we need the second letter? The second letter is here to explain the reason for the first letter, like it says. Esther writes a second letter, right, with authority, in order to fulfill the meaning of the first letter. And therefore, what's the content of the second letter? She sends letters to all the Yudim in all 27. Divrei Shalom Le'emet. That's an explanation based on Zechariah. And the purpose of the letter is that we keep the Purim at the right time, like Mordechai and Esther did, with the same authority and for the same underlying reason that we had the 4 fast days. Because the 4 fast days are not going to be fast days becoming holidays, if we keep Divrei Shalom Le'emet, and that we won't have to fast, Jerusalem can be rebuilt. Okay. Now, then the question is, are there, in addition to that, are there any other allusions to this idea that God might have been upset that maybe the reason for almost calamity was because it was like a wake-up call because we didn't return to Yerushalayim when we were supposed to. Now, before I bring those examples, let me take a quick break here and share with you a Kuzari. Remember, in the Melech, everyone knows the book of Kuzari about Rabbi Yehuda Levi. And let me put the Kuzari here. Kuzari. Yeah. Kuzari. Oh no, let's go alphabetical. JK. Kuzari, here we are. Kuzari. Better. Okay, that's good. And I have to share my screen. So the Melech, he has this discussion with Melech Kuzar. And here we are. And Rabbi Yehuda, the Chacham has this whole discussion about questions and answers all the time. And where are we? Here we are. Let me share my screen. And he talks about how great the land of Israel is. And then Melech Kuzar asks the famous question, where are we? Here we are. He says like this, okay? Now he asks him, the Melech Kuzar asks him after this whole big explanation how great Israel is, he says, hello, he asked him, Rabbi, why don't you make Aliyah? You're such a big deal about the land of Israel. He gives all these reasons why you should make Aliyah. And the only question the Chader can answer is this one. Remember, he says, okay. So in the answer he gives to Melech Kuzar, what happened? He says, you're right, we should be making Aliyah, but we're not. It's like the most Zionistic, it's not by chance he makes Aliyah, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, at the end of his life. Okay. The second temple could have been the final temple. Didn't have to be a third. It could have been the final one. As Zechariah said, the Shekhinah was supposed to return. Beit Sheni could have been greater than Beit Rishon, as Haggai said. If they only made Aliyah, had they taken God's call to return, that Zechariah is explicit about, right? Then Beit Sheni could have been great. Only some small group, all the important people, what happened? Let's get back up to the top here. Okay, Nisharu b'Bavel, they stayed in Tinek. Maskimim legalut v'shibud, b'vad shali pardu mishkatem me'eskev. They wouldn't want to leave their businesses in their homes. Okay, and then he gives, maybe that's what Shlomo was talking about in Shir HaShirim, called Dodi the Fake. They titled for a book about Shivat Zion. He goes on. And then, okay, Sof Davar here. Sof Davar, Rak Chelek Min Ha'am. Let me get my annotator on. Annotate and spotlight here. Sof Davar, my annotator. Oh, we should spotlight. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Sof Davar, here we go. Sof Davar, Rak Chelek Min Ha'am Ne'ena, V'lo B'lev Shalem. ולכן גמלה מלוא כמחשבת ליבם. והתקיימו בהם ההבטחות האלה רק במידה מצומצמת. What God promised, we got out of it what we put into it. Okay? And he gives a big cloud. But spirituality is potential. And you can only get out of it as much as you put into it. Okay? He says, he says, even our generation. Ilu hayinu muchanim dikareb al Hashem alevatenu b'lev shalem. Ki az haya Hashem yitbarach Mosheinu kasher shi'et avatenu mitzrayim. After Hashem davar came, then he makes the famous line that when we daven in dvarim shanon b'tfilatenu, you stop with our kodshal, everything we say, there's all these prayers we're having. And but when we daven, it's like, what do you call it? Like a parakeet chirping, or like a hummingbird humming. He says we're davening with, in a nutshell, he's saying we might be davening with kavana, but we're not davening with havana. Because we're saying things and don't understand what we're saying, we don't mean what we're saying. Anyway, that's the famous Causal you've seen before. But I want to use that to support my whole point, that there was great potential with Beit Sheni. If I'm looking for a reason, not only why we're saved, but why we're almost destroyed, it could be the Gzerot HaBaman, where, what do you call it? Were instituted as a wake-up call to Am Yisrael to remember that they should have come back and they didn't. Now, then the question is, are there other things like this alluded to in the Megillah? So one thing which is good, I don't have on the source sheet, but you can look it up later on. Anyone remember what date the first letters were sent out? The Gzer of Haman was sent out on the 13th day of the first month. Remember? Maybe I'll share my screen real fast. Where are we? Here we go. I go back to my Tanakh. Where are we? We're going to go back to Esther. Esther. Oh, so my Tanakh today. In Perek Gimel in Esther, the first letter, Perek Gimel, towards the end, they send out the letter. B'nishach Svarim, on what day? Here it is. The letter goes out on the 13th of Nisan, Mamash Erev Pesach, surprise, surprise. And then there's remember? And then Mordechai, here's what happened. He calls Esther, the whole thing. And the 3-day fasting is probably, that's why Causal says on Pesach. What happens. And even though Haman's dead within a couple of days, and Esther begs to write a new letter to rescind the first letter, look when the second letter is sent. The second letter is sent when? Take a look. By Christopher Melech. On the 23rd of Sivan. How many days elapsed between the 13th of Nisan and the 23rd of Sivan? Do the math. There's 17 days left in 30 days of Iyar and 23 days of Sivan. What's 17, 23, and 30? 70, right? So for 70 days, every Jew thinks they're about to be destroyed. 70 days they're biting their nails. Now, is there a concept anywhere in Tanakh, a day for a year, a day for a year? That's the Meraglim, right? The idea of punishment, a day for a year. And what was the chet of the Meraglim? Remember not having a chance to go to Israel, not going? Not taking the challenge? Again, that might be an illusion. That might be totally coincidental, or maybe there's something going on. So I'll give another example. I'll bring a couple more examples, and then I want to bring some more examples that might be alluding to this hidden message, hidden pun intended. And is Esther purposely, right, alluding all the time to the idea of Yerushalayim, but not saying it explicitly, but assuming the reader can figure it out if he knows his Tanakh and knows his history and knows the theme of Tanakh. Okay, now back in Zechariah, we're going to go back to Zechariah. Again, that was assumption. We'll find other things in Megillat Esther that relate to this prophecy of Zechariah and that time period. So after Zechariah says the fast days have become holidays, he ends the parak as follows. There's not only will the fast days become holidays, a time will come where Beit Sheni can be so great that other nations will come to visit Jerusalem. It will only be Jews coming to visit Jerusalem asking questions about fasting. There'll be non-Jews coming to Yerushalayim, as Yeshayahu had predicted. That non-Jews will come to look for God. All nations will come looking for this concept of godliness. That Yerushalayim will be an international center of people looking for a connection to God. They won't be Jewish, but we'll be sitting in a position where people look up to us and we'll be representing God properly. We'll sanctify God by our national behavior. And then it says things can be so great. At that time, it'll be so great, Zachariah says, it'll be so crowded that an Ish Yehudi in the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim will be waiting, we'll have an audience of 10 people waiting in line for guidance from him. Now this phrase Ish Yehudi is 2 times in Tanakh. In case you didn't figure that out. Zachariah mentioned Ish Yehudi, who's supposed to be in Yerushalayim teaching Torah, that's it, giving guidance, spiritual guidance, sanctifying God in God's city in Yerushalayim. And what happens in Megillat Esther? Where's our Ish Yehudi?
Ish Yehudi hayo b'Shushan habira.
And for God's sake, what's his name? Marduk.
Mordechai.
Mordechai, which is now it's not just a non-Jewish name, it's the name of the Babylonian god who, according to the Cyrus Declaration, Marduk was the Babylonian god who dumped the Babylonians and brought Koresh in. Like when you read the Cyrus Declaration, he gives all the credit to Marduk. Like Marduk is the Babylonian god who now likes the Persians better than the Babylonians, who Koresh gives all the credit to. As Yeshayahu himself mentions in 2 Isaiah. And he should be in Shushan Bira, and his name is Mordechai, instead of making a name for God. Now, it doesn't mean he's not religious, but his parents are assimilated, that's for sure. Now, again, that message is not explicit, but it's implicit maybe, but it's hidden. But maybe just calling Esther might be relating to that idea of something being hidden.
The prophecies come true when you're waiting in Misrata up mean in line, and maybe it comes true.
For the prayer. Yeah. Now, remember, now in we talk about this big party. Remember Shushan Abira, 30 years reign. And remember that our minhag of Bechelim Michelim Shonim, we say that's alluding. But what did Chazal say? Chazal say 2 things in the Midrash. Why was Achashverosh making the party? Because he miscalculated and thought Yirmiyahu's 70 years were over. Now that can't be pshat, not it. Why make a party for all the army of Paras Umadai? If you know your real history, in the 30th year of his reign, he's launching a big attack against Greece. And he gives a speech, Herodotus writes about it, calling himself Melech Machem Lachim. And the whole army is gathered in Shushan, preparing the battle. It's exactly in that year 3 that the Megillah begins, got it? And it looks like it's a big party, but it's beside the Chelim Mechelim Shonim, got it? We're alluding both by Chazal saying they were using the kelim of the Beit HaMikdash, remember? And he's making a party because Yirmiyahu's 70 years were over, and the Jews were participating and using the kelim of the Beit HaMikdash. Now, that might be a misdemeanor of what's called Me'ilah, but it might be a felony. That what? That we had the chance to return and we didn't return. Now, and then another allusion. When we talk about Mordechai, why did we go back 4 generations? Like Ben Yair, Ben Shvi, Ben Kish, Ishimini, and a fellow Pshat, who's Asher Glam Yerushalayim is not referring to Mordechai, because Mordechai would be like an old man. He'd be 200 years old if he was in the exile, but rather his great-grandfather was exiled from Yerushalayim. So that explains why am I going back 4 generations in Mordechai's Yichus, right? To Kish, by doing what? By saying his great-grandfather was exiled from Babel, but now it's 4 generations now in Babel, and we should have been back already. Okay? But again, we're alluding to, we finally mentioned Yerushalayim, but Galut from Yerushalayim in the Megillah 1 time. In this Ish Yehudi, who should be in Yerushalayim HaBira. Now we'll see in a minute, the word Bira beforehand was only used to describe the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. We'll see that in Hebrew in a minute. Now, if we're alluding, if the name Melech, if God's name is missing, and it's in Tanakh, then God's name is, what does Chazal say? Sometimes Melech and Achashverosh, who's the king. So when Haman says to the king about the Jews, there's this nation of Amachan Fuzafrad Ben Amim, but that Melech Inam Shomim, so that's Haman talking to Achashverosh, but maybe there's a second voice there, of God talking to Am Yisrael. Because we don't listen to our king. And why should God continue watching over us if he gave us the opportunity to return and we don't return? What's the point? And this is maybe a little bit too far, but this might explain why we have the first story in the Megillah. Because what happens? We have this king, remember, this great Persian king, Achashverosh, who has a trophy wife. Imagine a great king marrying this beautiful trophy wife to show how great he is. And what's he want? He wants his trophy wife to come and show off her beauty at the big party to make the king look great. In other words, the king calls his wife in to show off the beauty of the king, how great the king is. And she doesn't want to come. And boy, the king gets angry. Now, might that be alluding to God, Akash Baruch Hu, right? According to the Nevi'im, like all those later Nevi'im, use the analogy of a marriage analogy in God and his people, calling his wife to show off his beauty, and she doesn't want to come and do what she was chosen for. It might be alluding to that. Maybe it's taking too far, but it might explain why that first story is there in the Megillah. And look at the ramifications. What happened? What they say? Why is he so? What's Menachem saying? Okay. What Vashti did was not only a bad to the king. What happened? Okay. He had said, everybody, right? If that's how Vashti acts, what do you want from everybody else? Right? And what's the answer to Vashti's terrible action? Right? To do what? Everyone has to keep their ethnic identity. Well, there's one people who don't have their ethnic identity, that's the Jews. Okay. And then the word birah, of course, is only in Divrei Yamim, when David builds the Beit HaMikdash in Divrei Yamim. So David, remember, wants to build, but he can't, but because he has to wait for his son to take over, as God told him. But he gets everything ready for his son Shlomo to build it. So David tells Shlomo in Divrei Yamim, B'nei Echad b'char bo alim na'avarach b'melacha gdola, ki lo la'adam ha'birah ki l'Hashem Elokim. This is the first time we have the word birah in Tanakh. And what's the birah? It's referring to specifically the building of the Beit HaMikdash. It might mean technically a tower, but this is its only use. It's the first use in Tanakh. Especially in second, and it's about by Rishon, but it's Second Temple literature. And therefore, we have the word birah referring not just to Yerushalayim, but the Beit HaMikdash in Yerushalayim. Okay? And this is B'chol Chochi tells them I get everything ready to build the house for God, the gold, the silver. And then they collect all the silver. Now, this is cute. How much silver did they collect to build the first temple? This is in honor of Parsha Pekudei. Remember, Parsha Pekudei, we get how much gold and silver? So in this week's Parsha, we had 100 kikar, remember, of silver? Remember in Parsha Pekudei? There's 29 kikar of gold and 100 kikar of silver for the Machzita Shekel. Chumash does the math. Look how much silver they collected for the first Beit HaMikdash. Okay, how much? Okay, well, the kesef kikaraim 10,000. 10,000 kikar kesef. That's the amount of silver collected to build the first temple, with David's to build the birah. How much money does Haman give Achashverosh?
10,000.
10,000 what?
Kikars.
Kikar, what metal?
Silver, kesef.
Nothing. What a coincidence. Right? Again, all these things might be coincidences, but when all those coincidences come up, there might be something going on. Okay? And then, in case you didn't know, the people were very happy about their Idnatvut, and then right afterwards, the famous Vayvarech David, we say every day Pesukei Simra. So the word birah is used one more time in Divrei Yamim. And then all of a sudden, what did we find? Mordechai is in Shushan HaBirah. Because what's replaced Yerushalayim? Shushan, got it? And to prove that Merodach is is a Babylonian name, well, we have it in Beit Rishon, but there's two Babylonian kings named Merodach. There's Merodach Baladan ben Baladan. Remember who comes to Chizkiyahu after Sancheriv? That's in Perek Lamed Tet in Yeshayahu and in Melachim, in the right Perek in Melachim. Remember Merodach Baladan? He comes and Chizkiyahu gives him the royal tour, and then Yishau gets angry at him. Says, why are you showing your house up to the Babylonians? He's going to come and destroy it one day. That's one. But at the end of Melachim, it's really interesting. Year 37 after Galut Yachin. And what happened in year 12, whatever that month was? Nasil Evil Morodach Melech Babel Shnat Mocho at Rosh Yachin. Yachin finally gets out of jail 37 years after his exile. Who takes him out? Evil Morodach, or evil Morodach. I don't know if it's evil or not, but almost all the Babylonian kings have the name of their god in their name. So we know that Merodach, we know from outside sources, Marduk, is the great Babylonian god, and and all the kings have his name. Many of the kings have his name in their royal name. Remember, there's Merodach Baladan and Evil Merodach, and there's no Jews during Beit Rishon with that name. And all of a sudden, in Beit Sheni, we have a guy named Mordechai who's our leader. So now it became a Jewish name, but there's definitely no Jewish source to the name. So it's definitely a Babylonian name, like our months. Okay? But it's interesting, that's how Sefer Melachim ends, where it's like the beginning of return, like the first half was destroyed, but there's a big hope that maybe there'll be a bit of return when Yochanan gets out of jail. So so the source sheet has all the source sheet, which I'm sharing with you, has a lot of these analogies thing, and that's the big question. I'll go back to my opening point. That's the question. Whoever wrote Megillat Esther, my assumption is it's a generation later. Why? There must have been this custom, but the book was written to sort of give meaning to Purim. But the question is, was the book written so that the reader reads? Is the book written with a hidden message? Now, there's two possibilities. Either the message is explicit in the book or implicit. Got it? Either it's Nigla or Nister. Now, the Nigla message for sure is not about God. What's the proof? God's isn't mentioned. So no, but it's in Tanakh, so it must have a prophetic message. So if the message isn't Nigla, it's got to be Nistar. And Dafka, by not mentioning God's name, which should be mentioned, that's telling you that God's name is hidden. And when the heroine, her name is hidden, got it? Her name is Esther. And it goes out of the way to tell you that, because her name is really Hadassah. And all these people's names, and Mordechai's name is meaningful. The question is the story written in a manner where the author wants the reader, but assuming the reader knows his Tanakh and knows his history because it was the previous time period, he knows that Achashverosh was the king after Dayavesh, and he knows Nivot Zechariah and Nivot Chagai, etc. Is this supposed to be a wake-up call? God gave us an opportunity, we didn't answer it. And sure enough, the next generation after Megillat Esther is when Ezra makes Aliyah. There's a bit of return. Now, if the answer is if the answer is so good, I mean, if it's a question, why don't people find it? So that's always a question about when you hide something, somebody might hide it too good. So this might explain several minhagim for him. One is why our custom in Halacha to turn Shushan Purim into Yerushalayim Purim, and to allude it to Mei Yeshua ben Nun. We're bringing Israel back into the picture for sure. That's number one. Number two, why? Oh, this is sort of a joke, right? One way not to get the message is to get drunk. Because if you can't tell between Mordechai and Esther, if you're drunk, if the message is hidden, one way not to find a hidden message is basically don't use your be drunk and you won't notice it. Or maybe the idea of everything being masqueraded, the idea that there's hidden message, maybe the idea of dressing up, even though I doubt that's the real reason, but maybe it's prophetically it came out that way. That the that there's maybe a hidden message behind the book itself. Now, it's interesting in the Turgum HaShivim of Esther, all of a sudden God's back in the Megillah. Everywhere where God should be, all of a sudden there's all these stories where we're actually davening to God. I don't know if you've ever read the Septuagint, the Esther version, the Greek version of Esther, but it's much firmer than our version. It's got God where he should be. The question was that's a question was that the original and our Esther took it out, or probably it's the other way around. The original was written this way. In Greek times, they couldn't accept the book without, the firm people couldn't accept a book without God being mentioned, so they put God into the book where he should be. That's a question about when you study the Turgum of Esther and the Septuagint. Now, in general, this is what the share I just gave you is basically what a lot of academic people say what happens, how every society interprets the Megillah based on their own hashkafas. Got it? So in Chutz La'aretz, the classic things, Megillat Esther, that's the book for Jews in exile. What did we learn from the book? That even Jews in exile, God's with us no matter where we are. And wherever in trouble, God will always be there to help us. Don't worry about total destruction. And we read Megillat Esther to remember, no matter where we are in exile, anywhere on the globe, God's always with us. And it's got nothing to do with the land of Israel. It's the book of Jewish existence in exile. Other people say, I just heard a share on this yesterday from a professor, a Jewish professor, saying that the whole point of the Megillah is that he called it like APAC, meaning that the fate of Jerusalem would be determined by the Jews in Shushan, because Jerusalem was an unwalled city in the time of if it's during like Seder Olam, the wall it's before Nehemiah for sure. So the walls are built, and therefore Jerusalem is in terrible peril. And if Gzeret Haman will come through, Jerusalem will be wiped out. And what saves Jerusalem? The Jews in Shushan, the APAC Jews, the political influence of the Jews in Shushan saved Yerushalayim. So we learn from the book how important it is for Jews to be in Chutz La'aretz, involved in government, so they can help the people in Jerusalem. Like that's a classic. What I'm getting at is, and then they accuse me of the same thing. Got it? I'm taking a Zionist degree because I made Aliyah and I've been a Zionist, and I give a shir for Torah Mitzvah. So I just think that this approach is really rooted in the text. If you know the theme of Tanakh, if you know the Machronim, and you understand your Zechariah, especially that's why I put the anchor with the second letter, the Divrei Shalom V'Emet, and the 4 fast days becoming holidays. And the core idea, let's go back to my original question. If I'm establishing a holiday, an eternal one, it has to have eternal meaning for the Jewish people. And therefore, if it's about Yerushalayim, about the fact we didn't return, but it's not enough just to return to Yerushalayim and return to Israel and build a temple. The main thing is not building a temple, it's building a just society. That's the Divrei Shalom V'Emet. And the core mitzvot of Purim, that's the beginning of redemption. It's so simple, but so hard to keep. It's much harder than fasting, isn't it? To think good things about Israel, Ishet Achiv, check out the Havel, and what do you call it? Ishet Rat Real Tachshu B'Chem. Remember Yirmiyahu saying? It's especially when you're idealistic, it's so easy to think the other guy's wrong, the other guy's evil, the other guy's bad. Just look at the Knesset. To be able to overcome that and realize you're working as a team and do things and strive for truth and justice and kindness, and Israel should be known for that type of society, that's the beginning, that's where redemption begins. With that type of society, that makes us worthy of building a Beit HaMikdash, worthy of God watching our history and taking over us. So to rebuilding Yerushalayim begins like at home and communities, and not before actual construction begins. Anyway, so that was my little hidden message.
Before Shlema.
Okay, thank you. I'll take another last minute or two for questions if anybody has. And they shared the, you guys have the source sheet, right? They sent it. I sent it late, so send it. Can I share the, let me see if I can share on the chat real quick. Chat, Dropbox, Drive, Google Drive. So I'm gonna need to do no, I can't take it from my computer. But Ayala will send it out to you. Ayala has it, she'll send it. Maybe she's on. Yeah. I'll send a note to Ayala to send it to everybody. I was supposed to send it yesterday and I forgot. Sorry. Okay, no more questions? We're good?
For Shlema.
Okay, thanks. And have a Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov for Shlema.
We'll go to Simcha.